Good morrow, scholars. Welcome back to my The Last Jedi a video essay, so to speak. For this particular video, I'd kind of like to go over my personal biggest complaints with the film as a whole from a structure perspective, not so much like how I've said in previous videos, how I don't really agree with how they portrayed Luke or Rey or really anybody, but that's not the point. Uh, the the thing about this movie that I think exemplifies my problems with it as a whole is probably that fight scene in Snoke's throne room. And I understand that a lot of people love it, and it's perfectly fine if you do. However, for me, and I don't claim to be an expert, I never will, but I have gone over so many hours of choreography, everything from the lightsaber choreography competition going back, I want to say 12 years, or somewhere around there. In each year, there's like 30-something entries. There's so many schools out there where they'll do like live performances at various conventions. There's quite a few. I think it's something like the School of Saber Fighting. I think it's stationed out of Russia. There's a lot, and you've seen, I'm sure, some of my videos where me and Charlie are trying to come up with various choreographies. And while I will admit that we will never get to the level where I think we would be noteworthy in terms of combat, at least we're trying to do various techniques that not only look good on camera, but also make sense. And that's where a lot of this movie kind of falls flat for me, is that they try and do like these big, showy, and very flashy things, but they don't have any setup for it. I know I've talked about Rey's prowess with a lightsaber and just fighting in general before in various videos here and there. And while in episode 7, I defended her because she very clearly has some training, and you know, a lot of people have already talked about this. I'm sure you're kind of over it, but we have to acknowledge, or I have to acknowledge, that she is a decent fighter on her own, and then she gets sort of amplified, so to speak, through the Force, and I'm perfectly fine with that. My only real gripe with it is that the choreography itself was so terrible in my eyes. Like, I was actively cringing the entire time. Like, those of you that don't like the prequels, and you, I know a lot of people will say they liked the pod racing scenes, and then there are those of you, those of us that don't like the prequels and hate the pod racing scene, or maybe a better example, those of you that didn't like the Canto Bight sequence, just like didn't want it to be on the screen, couldn't bear to look at it. That's how I was with that fight choreography in that particular scene. And I have a few like examples specifically. There's a moment when Rey brings her lightsaber up into like an upper guard, like so, so the lightsaber's like going parallel to her head, and for whatever reason, she's gone like this about 3 seconds or so in advance, and then she's got a Praetorian guard here, here, and here. And all three of them, from their different angles of attack, each attack the lightsaber instead of trying to attack her, which is a big thing that you'll see that gets called out on the lightsaber choreography competition, various what do you call it? The videos, the judges, whenever they're actually judging the videos, they make note very often, mind you, because again, not all of them are great. Whenever an attack is going for the lightsaber, so like, let's say I'm going to guard here, and somebody has their lightsaber, about right, we'll say about right there, and instead of like them going and then me reacting, we're meeting each other at the same time, even though it doesn't look right. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of that going on in that particular scene. There's various like parries whenever somebody's making a motion, and maybe the fight looks better if they had gotten a different angle, not unlike with Luke and his force kick in Return of the Jedi. But the whole fight is just a mismatch of what would you say? Of different moves, all cobbled together. It seems like that afternoon, and it's very strange for me because if you go back and you watch the fight scene between Palpatine and Mace Windu and the others, shout out to my boy Kid Fisto. I don't know why I just did that, but Ian McDiarmid had about 15 minutes, I think, max, to learn the choreography for that particular fight, because I forget what happened with the stuntman, and they like needed close-up shots of him. And another thing that from the LCC is you can't just cut from one thing to the next. So let's say we did, let's say I did an attack towards your head, and you did a block. If you just cut to something else, say like us, going here, and then you blocking your arm, it's going to be rather noticeable that instead of picking up where you left off, or rather you doing that, it's not going to like flow. I think that's the best way to describe it. Like, there's no rhythm to it. It's just, you know what I mean? And it really slows down the fight. Now, I get that it doesn't literally slow it down. It actually is quite fast-paced. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't really work for me that well, is that they're moving fast, but they're not quick. If that makes sense to you. It's like the difference between being agile and being able to like run really fast. Like, because if you wanted to do parkour, for instance, you need to be much more agile than you need to be just being able to run fast. If I'm making any sense, let me know. If I'm not making sense, definitely let me know down in the comments. But you know what I mean? And then, like I said with that, initial thing of that block, her whole fight from her side, since Kylo Ren's his problems or my problems with his half of the fight are a little different. Just the blocks are so random and they're haphazard, and it doesn't make any sense. One thing that this one particular YouTube channel, Terra Prime Light Armory, I'm a part of the group on Facebook. You should check them out if you haven't already. Anyway, they talk about oh shoot, what is it called? Let me think. Dang it, I just had it. Why did I forget? Let's see. I remember now. Okay. You don't actively have to meet your lightsaber to their lightsaber. Sometimes the best thing to do is dodge. And I feel like if they didn't just put a bunch of like blocks here and there and everywhere, it would have gone a little bit more smooth. Because I understand like you don't want to like retreat, give ground because then they can like press the attack and what have you. But at the same time, it's still got to look good, right? So it's one of those like darned if you do, darned if you don't sort of things, I suppose. But I think they could have really made it work if they had just put a little more effort into it. And it's really weird because, from what I understand, they actually got some rather famous fight choreographers, and I don't see it at all. Don't get me wrong, it certainly does look flashy, but that doesn't mean it looks good. You know what I mean? Like if I did these videos with like a mullet and a backwards cap and like a bright neon sickly greenish yellow shirt and acid wash jeans, I'm going to look really flashy. I'm going to look really tacky. And I think that's kind of what I see when I look at that particular fight scene. And I understand if other people see something different and they see something that they actually enjoy. I don't want to say like you're stupid or you don't know how it should have gone or like anything like that. It's just from my perspective and comparing it to personal experience as well as studying on YouTube. It suffers from all these pitfalls that I see in a lot of fan films where they want to do lightsaber fights, but they care more about hitting the other lightsaber rather than actually making decent choreography. Because I'm sure you've seen some of the videos with me and my friends. I know that Tyler, you might remember him. He's a tall white guy. Never mind. He and I usually like do a little back and forth, like here, 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 and just kind of repeat back and forth. One advancing, one retreating, and then vice versa. And that's perfectly fine, but that's not really a choreography sort of thing. That's really just more of a, at best, a training exercise. At worst, it's incorrect training because you're not reacting to the opponent's blade anymore. You're just moving. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. But yeah, I think that's the best way I can sum up my takeaway from the whole movie is that it tried to be something really big and flashy and very showy, but there was no setup, and it ultimately failed to impress me because I've seen a lot better with a much lower budget. I'm sure you guys have seen that one fan film for Darth Maul, where it's him facing off against all those Jedi. That's such an amazing fan film. If you haven't seen it already, you really need to. I don't know what you're doing seeing this video if you haven't seen that one. That doesn't make sense to me at all. If you have seen it and you're watching this video, I suggest you pause this, go watch that, and then compare it to what you saw in The Last Jedi and see if maybe you can't understand how I am seeing that particular fight scene in Episode 8. Another thing I think really, really hurt that particular fight scene is just the editing, which is, for me, the whole movie suffers from poor editing, not unlike what's it called, Suicide Squad. While I did enjoy that film a great deal, it was a lot of fun for me. Uh, the editing, the pacing, all that sort of stuff was just um, it was done so half-heartedly that you couldn't really get invested into it. You know what I mean? Now, because it's me, and I like some of those characters in Suicide Squad, and I like the actors. I could get behind it anyway. I didn't have a problem with it nearly as much as I did The Last Jedi, and I think because we were expecting so much more that when it ended up like hitting closer to like instead of like trying to reach up here to get 100 and then getting like an 80, I think it was shooting for an 80 and ended up getting like a 63. You know what I mean? Because it just kind of like, they were expecting us to love it anyway just because it's Star Wars, and I think that's not a good idea. And to kind of give you an idea of what I'm seeing when it comes to the editing, I know I'm kind of going off on tangents, but they kind of make sense. Have you seen The Lost World, Jurassic Park? If you haven't, I suggest you do. It's a really good movie. I love those films. Let's not get into that. There's a scene later on in the movie, The Lost World, that is, where one extra, little like no-name background character is suddenly in the foreground. They're all running in the tall grass. He turns around, looks up, shines his flashlight, and starts screaming. The camera then cuts to a different point of view, and you see a velociraptor then jump out of the tall grass, up into the air, and land on the guy. Now, what's going on is the guy is reacting before the velociraptor even like jumps up out of the grass to get him. And it's a goof, admittedly. Nothing can be perfect, but I kind of give that a pass because it's kind of hard to show both angles at the exact same time. Like overlapping them, but at the same time you've got to show one and then the other. So I didn't mind it too much. I didn't even really notice it until my dad mentioned it in the middle of a, what do you call it? I think we were having some sort of a family reunion. Or at least some family had been visiting. Anyway, with The Last Jedi, and specifically the fight scene in the throne room, there's just so much of that particular instance, like I said, with Rey in, her forward upper guard position. I forget what you would call it, but let's just assume this is Zone 1, when you're guarding, since your head is usually like the first target. I know that there was a lot of hullabaloo, which is a word that I don't get to use that often, where Rey's fighting with one of the Praetorian Guard, and he's got his two vibro knives with little things on them like the rest of them did. And then it cuts to Kylo Ren, and then back to her, and he's missing one, even though he was in a perfect position to just start stabbing her in the ribs and everything. And I don't see why people are complaining about that particularly, but at the same time, I feel like if they were going to do something like that, they really should have, because it would have been a great instance to show her actually being able to do proper techniques to disarm him, rather than cutting away and then, he must have dropped it somewhere, even though you clearly don't see it anywhere on the ground. You know what I mean? Instead of like, it's one of those things. It's kind of like the telling and not showing. You know, instead of actively telling us, they're like passively telling us, like, oh, he lost one of his weapons fighting with Rey while we weren't looking. And I'm like, that's fine, but you know, why give him two weapons if you weren't going to have him fight with both of them? You know what I mean? And the whole fight choreography in this scene is kind of the same. Really, the only highlights I feel would be the pass of Anakin Saber from Rey to Kylo when he, you know, gets the one guy from who's stroking him. And honestly, for me, that's kind of it. And unfortunately, like the last scene with Luke before, you know, where he's fighting with Kylo Ren on Crate, I didn't even like that particular fight scene. I say fight scene because, well, I mean, we all know now that there was no actual fight there. Luke's stance, it's so strange. Like, if you compare that to how his stance is, even back in Episode 5 when he's, you know, still new at fighting with a lightsaber, even with, you know, the years of practice that he had between the first two movies. It is so awkward to look at. It's like a duck who is also drunk. That's the best way I can describe his movements. And I don't know what happened. Ow. Look, I said at the beginning of this somewhere that I was not an expert in choreography, and the fact that my table hurt my hand, I think proves that. But that does not make my points any less valid. Anyway. You know, he's in such a strange guard. His center of gravity is too far forward. His stance is like, it's only done half-heartedly, like a lot of the editing I mentioned earlier. You know what I mean? Because let's see. I can't really show my feet, which is unfortunate. But you know, in Episode 6, you know, he stands back straight. He's leaning forward with like his knees, and then he's got his lightsaber out in front of him. You know, sort of a defensive position. In this, he's like this. Do you see the difference? It's much easier to be knocked over like this because my feet aren't quite far enough apart, and then my back, you know, like my upper body isn't being used as a counterweight. It's instead being moved forward, so it's much easier. If I wanted to do like a lunge attack, you know, I'm much more likely to throw too much of my weight forward and then fall over. You know what I mean? If I can, whenever I get around to fighting with somebody, well, you know, sparring, we'll say, if that sounds a little bit better, I'll show the difference between the two. Preferably have someone else do that so that I don't run the risk of falling, because I will hurt myself. Excuse me. And it really brought me down. I think if the choreography had actually been good, no offense again, I don't want to say like you're wrong or that you're dumb or anything. If I had thought the choreography had been good in the throne room or on Crate, because the whole thing, like I keep saying, is just flashy and it doesn't actually have any substance. It's kind of like empty calories whenever you're trying to eat healthily. Eat healthy. Anyway, it's just, it was really disappointing seeing what I saw as being not enough effort being put in. Like, they didn't care enough to have the choreography be the best it could be, and it's more of like, they'll like whatever we put out. And I don't want to say like, I don't even want to say like that, because that makes it sound like, people who do like it, that I think that they're dumb and that they'll agree to anything that ultimately gets put out by Disney in regards to the Star Wars movies, and I don't think that's the case. And I feel really bad that this is kind of the takeaway that I've gotten from it. But I cannot just, I can't get over how poorly set up everything was, how poorly executed it all was. You know what I mean? And I understand, like, this isn't really the first time Star Wars has had this problem. If you go back to the prequels, which, a lot of you, or a lot of people didn't really particularly enjoy, I see a lot of complaints about the lightsaber choreography, especially in Attack of the Clones with Yoda and his fight with Count Dooku. Like, you don't spin forward into an opponent's, weapons range. And you could say, in regards to Rey's, defensive stance, in that particular instance, the Force is like guiding her, showing her a vision. She's reacting, like they say. They see things before they happen, so they react to them before they happen. But my problem isn't really that, you can't hand wave everything by saying the Force did it. My problem is that the editing for that particular scene, and for most of that fight in the throne room, was so poorly done that it doesn't work well. It's fine if she wants to, bring up her saber to block all three attacks at once. I have no problem with that. My problem is that she does this before they even move to their, striking motions, and it just doesn't make any sense. I think I'm getting sick. I actually meant for this to be like a 15-minute video. I don't know what happened, but I know that I didn't say too much about it, but I have a lot to say about the choreography. It just was not nearly up to par. And if you liked it, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm sorry that I had to insult it so much in this video. I really didn't want to, but I can't deny how it looks to me. But if you wanna discuss it, you're more than welcome to. I have no problems acknowledging like someone who will see something different. Even if we're looking at the same thing. And who knows? Maybe you guys have some insight into it that I haven't considered. Or vice versa. You never know. But again, this is not about changing people's minds. This is about just acknowledging that there's another side, or sides, to all of this. I think that's about all I have to say in regards to this. And I hope it makes sense, talking about the choreography, and, the fight in universe, or skills. They weren't set up, they weren't executed, the filming didn't make them look nearly as good as they could have. Because let's be honest, if we go back to my example from Return of the Jedi, Luke's force kick looks so awkward. And if that kind of interaction between the main character and, the bad guys fighting him in the scene, or her, the throne room's fight scene is basically just that over and over and over again. And don't get me wrong, I love the Praetorian Guard. They look amazing. If they were to, for whatever reason, get like um, a Star Wars story film based on like their training and what they have to do, I'd be first in line absolutely to go see it. I just feel like that choreography needed so much work that they did not put in. And yeah, I think that's about it. Because I really genuinely think that that's at the root of all of this. Like my whole essay on this, the whole thing is basically I feel like they didn't put nearly enough effort into writing the story. Ryan Johnson didn't put nearly enough work into being, the director. Don't get me wrong. I always say a movie is guaranteed bare minimum of a ranking for me of 5 because there's a lot of work that goes into making that movie. I know I said I was done, but hang on. But there's a difference between showing up to work and doing your best. I genuinely feel like he showed up, did what he felt like doing, did what he did, but he didn't do all he could do. There's, I will occasionally think back to my first job, which I guess technically was also my second job because one store shut down and then I moved to another one after high school was done. So there was a gap. And my boss was like, when you started working here, you were like really good, hard worker, you got stuff done fast, but now it's been a few months or so. I think it was about 8 months or so. And, you're taking longer breaks, you're talking more often with your friends at work. Like, I know, I'm kind of slipping, stuff like that. Like, I'm still showing up to work, I'm still doing the job, but I'm not doing it nearly as well as I used to or could be doing. And I think that's really what ultimately led to this movie failing to meet expectations, is that it just did not put in all of the work. It just showed up and kind of shuffled along, and we're expected to love it for it anyway. You know what I mean? I don't know. If you could think of a better way to describe it, or if you're having trouble understanding me and want to talk more about like what did and did not pique your interest, if you enjoyed the fight scene, not to start an argument or anything, I really would love to hear your thoughts. Like, what was it about it that made you love it? Are they perhaps the same things that I saw, but it made me hate it? Like I said, this whole thing is about seeing things from different perspectives, and I really hope that we can have a civilized discussion. And we'll see where we go from here. So I hope I'm not getting sick. I'm going to go ahead and go to bed. Until next time, goodbye, everybody. Man, there are some days at work I will still cringe about the fight scene. I'm not going to lie.